And a big g'day to Sam and all the crew over there in the York Peninsula. Graham Anderson here from Agriculture Victoria with a climate update for 2017. Some of you might remember last year gave a bit of a recorded talk. It's still sitting there on YouTube, so if you want to have a look at that, that gave the longer term rundown of climate variability, recent trends and climate drivers for your part of the world. So if you want a bit of a refresher, it's still there if you want to watch it over a cup of tea. Most of what I'll go through here will talk about what's happened since and the forecast for this year. So last year was a bit wet. Here's the rainfall deciles for 2016. You can see here, this is a decile map. So deciles is just looking at long-term records, and decile 10 is where the rainfall last year was the equivalent of in the wettest 10% of years, and decile 1 is where rainfall for last year was in the driest 10% of years, and everything in between, this is average. So you can see most of Australia, and especially your part of the world, was around decile 10 or decile 8 and 9, so a pretty wet year for the whole of the year. And the story really last year was a chance to see the Indian Ocean Dipole fire up. So the Bureau's got some good web pages on that, and understanding when Indian Ocean Dipole's in its drier phases and years when it's in its wet phase. But last year it cranked into its what's called negative phase, negative IOD and wetter. And this is traditionally looking at 9 other IOD negative events. That's a part of Australia that tends to get wetter. And this is a sea surface temperature map which I showed you last year, but basically this is an anomaly map showing which areas of ocean might be 1 or 2 degrees warmer than normal, and the blue is where ocean's cooler. And you can see this is taken from July last year, but last year there was the expectation of a La Nina firing up out in the Pacific. It's trying to get started there, but the important thing to look at is this warm water all around the north of Australia, and especially this really extra warm water here out off the coast of Sumatra. That's what really helped fire up the IOD. And the Indian Ocean Dipole's in its wet phase when the warmest water's on this side and the cooler water's over on the African side. So it was really fired up last year. And this is a pressure pattern anomaly, just looking at again, say 30 days for July last year, where you can see out here is where all of this warm water was, and where that warmest water is up there, that generates the most cloud, gets the most uplift, and you basically get this low pressure forming. And what tends to happen, the scientists are still sort of working out the connection. Not only do we get a lot of extra moisture feed in through these northwest cloud bands into southeastern Australia, but also when that pattern sets up, it also helps to create a lower pressure in southeast Australia. So it does a couple of things: helps send more moisture and also helps with that lower pressure. So that's why the IOD negatives are a pretty handy thing, but they don't come every year. Just again looking at the different forecasts. This is from Dale Gray's Fast Break, and he looks at 11 different climate forecast models looking at their 3-month outlooks, and this is the one from last year looking at the May run, and you can see there all the May runs for June, July, August. This is the European model, that's the Bureaus, and Japanese. There's quite a number of models there, but you can see then a lot of the models thought there was a La Nina going to form out in the Pacific. They thought the IOD was a fair chance for IOD negative, so they ended up getting the IOD negative right. The La Nina just sort of pulled up short of being a proper La Nina. It was just on the edge of it, but you'll notice that there was quite a strong signal there, with most of the models there had a sort of wetter signal in the forecast. So last year there was a fair bit going on and they sort of picked it. So looking at that, here's Maitland's long-term rainfall record back to 1879 back here, and the long-term average is 502 mil, and you can see last year was pretty wet, up over the 700 mil mark, and that's up there with sort of one of your wettest 5 years. So a pretty big year in your part of the world. This is the summer. This doesn't include the summer just gone. That's the long-term averages for Maitland at summer. This is Maitland autumns. Interesting to note, I look at a lot of rainfall graphs, but this last 10 years of autumn rainfall at Maitland's as good as I've seen anywhere. So you've had a pretty good run of autumn. So might be a bit of a shock to the system if you're unlucky enough to get a dry one. But that's a good run there. winter. You can see that wet winter from last year, and up by is Maitland's spring rainfall, and you can see there, yeah, that was a pretty wet spring, but you were due for one, or that you just the back previous 5 or 6 were pretty dry. So last year we went through the importance of these climate drivers in terms of they're sitting behind our wetter and dry years in southeastern Australia. So the El Nino Southern Oscillation, sometimes it's sending us more moisture and being helpful, and then the Indian Ocean Dipole. So these pretty much like 2015, that dry year, we had an El Nino here, not sending much moisture, and we also had the Iodinous dry phase in 2015, so not helpful then. Then alternatively, last year we had almost a La Nina out here, but it was being a bit helpful, but we had the Indian Ocean Dipole in its wetter phase, sending plenty of moisture down here. So pretty important, always behind our bigger and wetter years. They don't always do something each year, so it's worth just keeping track on what they're up to. And here's what that dry pattern looks like. This is an example from September 2006. This is that sea surface temperature maps again, and these are areas of water that's warmer than average or areas of water that's cooler. A typical El Nino, you can see warm water kicks out here. What tends to happen then is there's more cloud out in the this part of the Pacific. It drags the trade winds back, ends up being a lower pressure out here and more cloud and higher pressure here. And what you see also is we get this cooler sea surface temperatures to the north of Australia, so that's not really good for generating extra cloud and moisture. And the same over in the Indian Ocean. You can see when the cooler water's there and the warmer water's over on the African side, that's more likely they're going to be getting all the cloud and activity over there. So that's one of the things we keep an eye on for a dry pattern, and keep a look at this sea surface temperature just to the north of Australia when we'll look at what a typical wet pattern looks like. So here it is back to spring 2010. You can see here, it's a big La Nina in the Pacific, cool water, all this warm water to Australia's north, so moisture pouring in everywhere. So that's basically the two extremes. And when we look at that long-term record at Maitland, especially when we look at the August to October rainfall, in longer term average, like a third of the years are decile 1 to 3, and a third are average, and a third are wet. But when we just pull out the 32 El Nino events at Maitland, it sort of doubles the chance of a dry spring. But you can see there's still a chance to snag a wet year or an average year in an El Nino. So it doesn't guarantee dry; it just doubles the chance. When La Nina's firing up, this is where it's a bit wetter, and you can see perhaps 1 in 5 La Ninas was drier, but it's certainly 3/4 of them were average or wetter. And also the Indian Ocean Dipole, whenever it's been in its drier phase, you can see then again at Maitland, it increases the chance of drier, doesn't guarantee it being dry. And IOD, that's what we had last year. It's actually one of the strongest signals when the IOD is in negative. You can see that you can still get a chance of drier, but much more greater chance of being wet. So thus far in 2017, well, here's January's rainfall. There's a fair bit of rain through Western Australia and coming through the centre because of all of this warm moisture over there, the carryover of that warm sea surface temperatures. So that fired up in January, and also we're still going with a bit of moisture around in February, and I think you got a bit of that over your part of the world as well. And then March, been a bit drier there of recent, and then most of the exciting stuff's been happening down along the coast with Cyclone Debbie. Now, I think I mentioned this last year that seasonal forecasts are probably a bit like getting the latest minutes of the Reserve Bank board meeting. That it's just a bit of a heads up about what the oceans are up to and what some of the commentary behind what they're doing. And sometimes, some years, there's some clear sort of signals of the ocean heading towards one of its wetter phases or dry phases, like last year. In other years, it's a bit less clear. And also, it's worth remembering that when it comes to seasonal forecasting, probably the best time to look at seasonal forecasting and the forecasting confidence in the outlook's probably best for sort of June, July, August, out into that sort of winter spring period. Autumn's the time of year where they talk about the autumn predictability barrier, and it's basically where those big oceans are still really setting themselves up. Some years they're making themselves clear earlier than others, so last year there were certainly some signals for wetter appearing earlier in the year. But what tends to happen with season forecasting is they get more confidence as you go through the season, and it's a bit like confidence in basically the form of your footy side. In that autumn, it's a bit hard to tell, but once they've been on the track for 2 or 3 months, you've got more of an idea if your team's going to be in the top four or the bottom four. So that's one thing to keep an eye on this year. There's still a lot could happen in terms of what does play out there in the Pacific Ocean. Having said that, the break, if you're interested, we provide monthly updates on this stuff, so it's worth watching the next couple of months just to see if those oceans are going to zig or zag. So here's the sea surface temperature anomaly map for the week of 6th to April. You can see here these colours are where water's warmer than long-term average, and these colours where it's cooler. So you can see out here in the Pacific at the moment, this is where most of the talk is about this extra warmth out here and whether this is sowing the seeds for a potential El Nino later in the year. Out in the central Pacific, the water's pretty neutral out there. You can see the water's still warm over in the Coral Sea area, and that's what helped fuel Cyclone Debbie. And things are a bit mixed out here in the Indian Ocean. But I guess one of the things is, while a lot of the global models are thinking that this will develop out into an El Nino later in the year, so this will, some of the things are suggesting that it may not, because we haven't got heat at depth. That's one of the things that's saying, well, that's there's not a lot of warm water underneath that's about to pop up. So that's one thing that's in our favour. The other thing is the trade winds normally blow towards Australia. So for an El Nino to develop, what usually happens is you actually see westerly wind bursts or the trade winds reversing. And so that's one of the things we haven't seen yet, but that's what we'll be keeping an eye on in the next month or two. Also, the pressure pattern, is the SOI is the difference in pressure from Tahiti to Darwin. So one of the things is, if those trade winds head out there, that direction, if the cloud pattern out here shifts towards the date line and you get a lower pressure out here in the Central Pacific and higher pressure here, that's when we'll be saying, okay, well, it looks like the El Nino is forming. So those things haven't happened yet. So all we've got at the minute is just the potential start of one. So fingers crossed that it doesn't develop further from here, but I guess we'll only know as we follow what happens in the next month or two. Looking at the model runs for March, this is for the next 3 months, April, May, June. That's the European model, the Bureau's model, Japanese, all different models there. Dale Gray has a look at these. One of the things they're looking at, most of the models are thinking that it'll be a pretty warm out in the Eastern Pacific, so approaching El Nino thresholds. Bit of a mixed bag there for the Indian Ocean. They're not really sure. But looking at the sort of rainfall signal for South Australia, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 6 of the 11 there have got a bit of a drier signal on them for the next 3 months. So that's probably reasonably strong. So average or slightly drier. That's certainly different to last year, where we had, a peppering of, wetter or average. So that's just for that the next 3 months. And then the longer term, really, which is a bit hard to tell, it's going to be all to do with what happens out there in the Pacific. But for July, August, September, the different models, there's most of them there are thinking El Nino will pop up. Sort of potential of an IOD positive, so it's a dry phase there, has popped up on a couple of them. And I guess 3 of the models there are thinking slightly drier, and another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 7 are thinking average. So that's a bit better. So I think part of what we'll be watching for is about whether that El Nino fires up or whether it doesn't. He is hoping that it doesn't. So there you go. So probably the outlook at the minute's a bit different to this time last year, where there was quite a few sniffs of wetter. At the moment, we've got some averages and a few sniffs of drier. So one of the things we'll be really trying to keep an eye on over the next month or two is just what happens out in the Pacific, and will the El Nino develop. So we'll be looking for what happens with those sea surface temperatures, whether we get those westerly wind bursts in the Pacific, and if the cloud and pressure pattern actually shift out that way. So that's what we're keeping an eye on. Some of the models think that'll happen, but it actually hasn't happened yet. That's the good news, is that 3 of these things haven't really happened yet. So there's still a chance for at least a neutral year, which would be good. And then about keeping an eye on what that Indian Ocean does too. It's not really clear yet what it's up to. But anyway, it's a bit different to the outlook this time last year, where there's that signal for wetter. whereas this year is probably more likely to be a little bit more cautious. Just for some context to what's happened at Maitland in previous El Nino events, Dale Gray has put this together, which is just basically these are all of the years where there was a designated El Nino, and this is the monthly rainfall for those years. And what Dale's just done here, though, is this is the August to October rainfall, and this is where the blue is where they were the wettest terciles. These were average years, and these are all the decile 1 to 3 years. So you can see more than half of them were drier years, but there were still some wet ones amongst them. And often when we talk El Nino, people think of 2006 or 1982, and you can see there they were shockers at Maitland in terms of spring rainfall. But that's not all El Ninos aren't like those two. You can see there's quite a range there. So yep, it does increase the chance of drier, but it doesn't guarantee it. You can see some of those El Ninos. There was some pretty big rainfall in your part of the world. So I guess that's part of what we'll be trying to make sense of for the rest of the year. One other thing I'll just mention, I did talk a bit last year just about temperatures and basically things getting a bit warmer, especially spring. You can see here last year how basically in the last 30 years, you've had about 4 years that have been cooler than the long-term average, and that's the influence last year of that Indian Ocean Dipole and all of that extra cloud cover certainly kept things cooler. So that was one of the things behind some of the decent yields and things there, and although it was a bit too wet in parts. So one of the things though to keep an eye on with El Nino is there tends to be, if there's less cloud cover around, then we're more likely to be there's less cloud cover, the inland heats up, and spring tends to be a bit warmer with those clearer skies. So that's part of the thing that tends to happen. So he's hoping that the El Nino doesn't fire up this year. So I hope that's of use to keep track of how things develop in the next month or two. Just drop an email to the break, and we can send you that monthly update. While it's focused on Victoria, the commentary around what those large ocean drivers are up to every bit as relevant for South Australia. And also got to thank, we don't normally sort of do talks outside of Victoria, but we do at the moment thanks to some federal funding, Rural Research and Development for Profit program funded by the federal government, and we're part of a Managing Climate Variability program, which is helping package up some of this stuff, do a bit of extension on this. So I hope you're finding that useful, and all the best with the rest of your workshop and for the year ahead.